Chapter 6. The Machine and the Maiden, A Night of Today. At the flat that evening, Carrie felt a new phase of its atmosphere. The fact that it was unchanged, while her feelings were different, increased her knowledge of its character. Minnie, after the good spirits Carrie manifested at first, expected a fair report. Hanson supposed that Carrie would be satisfied. "Well, he said, as he came in from the hall in his working clothes, and looked at Carrie through the dining room door. "How did you make out?" said Carrie. "It's pretty hard. I don't like it." There was an air about her which showed plainer than any words that she was both weary and disappointed. "What sort of work is it?" he asked, lingering a moment as he turned upon his heel to go into the bathroom. "Running a machine," answered Carrie. It was very evident that it did not concern him much, save from the side of the flat's success. He was irritated a shade because it could not have come about in the throw of fortune for Carrie to be pleased. Minnie worked with less elation than she had just before Carrie arrived. The sizzle of the meat frying did not sound quite so pleasing now that Carrie had reported her discontent. To Carrie, the one relief of the whole day would have been a jolly home, a sympathetic reception, a bright supper table, and someone to say, "Oh, well, stand it a little while. You will get something better," but now this was ashes. She began to see that they looked upon her complaint as unwarranted, and that she was supposed to work on and say nothing. She knew that she was to pay $4 for her board and room, and now she felt that it would be an exceedingly gloomy round, living with these people. Minnie was no companion for her sister, she was too old. Her thoughts were staid and solemnly adapted to a condition. If Hanson had any pleasant thoughts or happy feelings, he concealed them. He seemed to do all his mental operations without the aid of physical expression. He was as still as a deserted chamber. Carrie, on the other hand, had the blood of youth and some imagination. Her day of love and the mysteries of courtship were still ahead. She could think of things she would like to do, of clothes she would like to wear, and of places she would like to visit. These were the things upon which her mind ran, and it was like meeting with opposition at every turn to find no one here to call forth or respond to her feelings. She had forgotten, in considering and explaining the result of her day, that Druitt might come. Now, when she saw how unreceptive these two people were, she hoped he would not. She did not know exactly what she would do or how she would explain to Druitt, if he came. After supper she changed her clothes. When she was trimly dressed she was rather a sweet little being, with large eyes and a sad mouth. Her face expressed the mingled expectancy, dissatisfaction and depression she felt. She wandered about after the dishes were put away, talked a little with Minnie, and then decided to go down and stand in the door at the foot of the stairs. If Druitt came, she could meet him there. Her face took on the semblance of a look of happiness as she put on her hat to go below. "Carrie doesn't seem to like her place very well," said Minnie to her husband when the latter came out, paper in hand, to sit in the dining room a few minutes. "She ought to keep it for a time, anyhow," said Hanson. "Has she gone downstairs?" "Yes," said Minnie. "I'd tell her to keep it if I were you. She might be here weeks without getting another one." Minnie said she would, and Hanson read his paper. "If I were you," he said a little later, "I wouldn't let her stand in the door down there. It don't look good." "I'll tell her," said Minnie. The life of the streets continued for a long time to interest Carrie. She never wearied of wondering where the people in the cars were going or what their enjoyments were. Her imagination trod a very narrow round, always winding up at points which concern money, looks, clothes, or enjoyment. She would have a far-off thought of Columbia City now and then, or an irritating rush of feeling concerning her experiences of the present day, but, on the whole, the little world about her enlisted her whole attention. The first floor of the building, of which Hanson's flat was the third, was occupied by a bakery, and to this, while she was standing there, Hanson came down to buy a loaf of bread. She was not aware of his presence until he was quite near her. "I am after bread," was all he said as he passed. The contagion of thought here demonstrated itself. While Hanson really came for bread, the thought dwelt with him that now he would see what Carrie was doing. No sooner did he draw near her with that in mind than she felt it. Of course, she had no understanding of what put it into her head, but, nevertheless, it aroused in her the first shade of real antipathy to him. She knew now that she did not like him. He was suspicious. A thought will color a world for us. The flow of Carrie's meditations had been disturbed, and Hanson had not long gone upstairs before she followed. She had realized with the lapse of the quarter hours that Druitt was not coming, and somehow she felt a little resentful, a little as if she had been forsaken was not good enough. She went upstairs, where everything was silent. Minnie was sewing by a lamp at the table. Hanson had already turned in for the night. In her weariness and disappointment, Carrie did no more than announce that she was going to bed. "Yes, you'd better returned Minnie. You've got to get up early, you know. The morning was no better." Hanson was just going out the door as Carrie came from her room. Minnie tried to talk with her during breakfast, but there was not much of interest which they could mutually discuss. As on the previous morning, Carrie walked downtown, for she began to realize now that her $4.50 would not even allow her car fare after she paid her board. This seemed a miserable arrangement. But the morning light swept away the first misgivings of the day, as morning light is ever wont to do. At the shoe factory she put in a long day, scarcely so wearisome as the preceding, but considerably less novel. The head foreman, on his round, stopped by her machine. "Where did you come from?" he inquired. "Mr. Brown hired me," she replied. "Oh, he did, and then, see that you keep things going." The machine girls impressed her even less favorably. They seemed satisfied with their lot, and were in a sense common. Carrie had more imagination than they. She was not used to slang. Her instinct in the matter of dress was naturally better. She disliked to listen to the girl next to her, who was rather hardened by experience. "I am going to quit this," she heard her remark to her neighbor. "What with the stipend and being a plate, it's too much for me health." They were free with the fellows, young and old, about the place, and exchanged banter in rude phrases, which at first shocked her. She saw that she was taken to be of the same sort and addressed accordingly. "Hello," remarked one of the stout-wristed soul workers to her at noon. "Daisy." He really expected to hear the common "Go chase yourself!" in return, and was sufficiently abashed, by Carrie's silently moving away, to retreat, awkwardly grinning. That night at the flat she was even more lonely. The dull situation was becoming harder to endure. She could see that the Hansons seldom or never had any company. Standing at the street door looking out, she ventured to walk out a little way. Her easy gait and idle manner attracted attention of an offensive but common sort. She was slightly taken back at the overtures of a well-dressed man of 30, who in passing looked at her, reduced his pace, turned back, and said, "Out for a little stroll, are you, this evening?" Carrie looked at him in amazement, and then summoned sufficient thought to reply, "Why, I don't know you," backing away as she did so. "Oh, that don't matter," said the other affably. She bandied no more words with him, but hurried away, reaching her own door quite out of breath. There was something in the man's look which frightened her. During the remainder of the week it was very much the same. 1 or 2 nights she found herself too tired to walk home and expended car fare. She was not very strong, and sitting all day affected her back. She went to bed one night before Hanson. Transplantation is not always successful in the matter of flowers or maidens. It requires sometimes a richer soil, a better atmosphere to continue even a natural growth. It would have been better if her acclimatization had been more gratuitous, rigid. She would have done better if she had not secured a position so quickly, and had seen more of the city which she constantly troubled to know about. On the first morning it rained. She found that she had no umbrella. Minnie loaned her one of hers, which was worn and faded. There was the kind of vanity in Carrie that troubled at this. She went to one of the great department stores and bought herself one, using $1.25 of her small store to pay for it. "What did you do that for, Carrie?" asked Minnie when she saw it. "Oh, I need one, said Carrie. "You foolish girl." Carrie resented this, though she did not reply. She was not going to be a common shop girl, she thought. They need not think it, either. On the first Saturday night Carrie paid her board, $4. Minnie had a quaver of conscience as she took it, but did not know how to explain to Hanson if she took less. That worthy gave up just $4 less toward the household expenses with a smile of satisfaction. He contemplated increasing his building and loan payments. As for Carrie, she studied over the problem of finding clothes and amusement on 50 cents a week. She brooded over this until she was in a state of mental rebellion. "I am going up the street for a walk, she said after supper. "Not alone, are you?" asked Hanson. "Yes, returned Carrie. "I wouldn't, said Minnie. "I want to see something, said Carrie, and by the tone she put into the last word they realized for the first time she was not pleased with them. "What's the matter with her?" asked Hanson, when she went into the front room to get her hat. "I don't know, said Minnie. "Well, she ought to know better than to want to go out alone." Carrie did not go very far, after all, she returned and stood in the door. The next day they went out to Garfield Park, but it did not please her. She did not look well enough. In the shop next day she heard the highly colored reports which girls give of their trivial amusements. They had been happy. On several days it rained and she used up car fare. One night she got thoroughly soaked, going to catch the car at Van Buren Street. All that evening she sat alone in the front room looking out upon the street, where the lights were reflected on the wet pavements, thinking. She had imagination enough to be moody. On Saturday she paid another $4 and pocketed her 50 cents in despair. The speaking acquaintanceship which she formed with some of the girls at the shop discovered to her the fact that they had more of their earnings to use for themselves than she did. They had young men of the kind whom she, since her experience with Druitt, felt above, who took them about. She came to thoroughly dislike the light-headed young fellows of the shop. Not one of them had a show of refinement. She saw only their workday side. There came a day when the first premonitory blast of winter swept over the city. It scudded the fleecy clouds in the heavens, trailed long, thin streamers of smoke from the tall stacks, and raced about the streets and corners in sharp and sudden puffs. Carrie now felt the problem of winter clothes. What was she to do? She had no winter jacket, no hat, no shoes. It was difficult to speak to Minnie about this, but at last she summoned the courage. "I don't know what I am going to do about clothes, she said one evening when they were together. "I need a hat." Minnie looked serious. "Why don't you keep part of your money and buy yourself one? She suggested, worried over the situation which the withholding of Carrie's money would create. "I'd like to for a week or so, if you don't mind, ventured Carrie. "Could you pay $2? Asked Minnie. Carrie readily acquiesced, glad to escape the trying situation, and liberal now that she saw a way out. She was elated and began figuring at once. She needed a hat first of all. How many explained to Hanson she never knew. He said nothing at all, but there were thoughts in the air which left disagreeable impressions. The new arrangement might have worked if sickness had not intervened. It blew up cold after a rain one afternoon when Carrie was still without a jacket. She came out of the warm shop at 6 and shivered as the wind struck her. In the morning she was sneezing, and going downtown made it worse. That day her bones ached and she felt lightheaded. Towards evening she felt very ill, and when she reached home was not hungry. Minnie noticed her drooping actions and asked her about herself. "I don't know, said Carrie. "I feel real bad." She hung about the stove, suffered a chattering chill, and went to bed sick. The next morning she was thoroughly feverish. Minnie was truly distressed at this, but maintained a kindly demeanor. Hanson said perhaps she had better go back home for a while. When she got up after 3 days, it was taken for granted that her position was lost. The winter was near at hand, she had no clothes and now she was out of work. "I don't know, said Carrie. I'll go down the Monday and see if I can get something. If anything, her efforts were more poorly rewarded on this trial than the last. Her clothes were nothing suitable for fall wearing. Her last money she had spent for a hat. For 3 days she wandered about, utterly dispirited. The attitude of the flat was fast becoming unbearable. She hated to think of going back there each evening. Hanson was so cold. She knew it could not last much longer. Shortly she would have to give up and go home. On the 4th day she was downtown all day, having borrowed 10 cents for lunch from Minnie. She had applied in the cheapest kind of places without success. She even answered for a waitress in a small restaurant where she saw a card in the window, but they wanted an experienced girl. She moved through the thick throng of strangers, utterly subdued in spirit. Suddenly a hand pulled her arm and turned her about. Well, said a voice. In the first glance she beheld Druitt. He was not only rosy-cheeked, but radiant. He was the essence of sunshine and good humor. "Why, how are you, Carrie?" he said. "Urea Daisy. Where have you been?" Carrie smiled under his irresistible flood of geniality. "I've been out home, she said. "Well, he said, I saw you across the street there. I thought it was you. I was just coming out to your place. How are you, anyhow?" "I am all right, said Carrie, smiling. Druitt looked her over and saw something different. "Well, he said, I want to talk to you. You're not going anywhere in particular, are you?" "Not just now, said Carrie. "Let us go up here and have something to eat. George. But I am glad to see you again." She felt so relieved in his radiant presence, so much looked after and cared for, that she assented gladly, though with the slightest air of holding back. "Well, he said as he took her arm, and there was an exuberance of good fellowship in the word which fairly warmed the cockles of her heart. They went through Monroe Street to the old Windsor dining room, which was then a large, comfortable place, with an excellent cuisine and substantial service. Druitt selected a table close by the window, where the busy rout of the street could be seen. He loved the changing panorama of the street to see and be seen as he dined. "Now, he said, getting Carrie and himself comfortably settled, what will you have?" Carrie looked over the large bill of fare which the waiter handed her without really considering it. She was very hungry, and the things she saw there awakened her desires, but the high prices held her attention. Half-broiled spring chicken 75. Sirloin steak with mushrooms 125. She had dimly heard of these things, but it seemed strange to be called to order from the list. "I'll fix this, exclaimed Druitt. "SST. Waiter. That officer of the board, a full-chested, round-faced Negro, approached, and inclined his ear. "Sirloin with mushrooms, said Druitt. "Stuffed tomatoes. Yes, assented the Negro, nodding his head. "Hashed brown potatoes. You said asparagus. Yes, and a pot of coffee. Druitt turned to Carrie. "I haven't had a thing since breakfast. Just got in from Rock Island. I was going off to dine when I saw you." Carrie smiled and smiled. "What have you been doing?" he went on. "Tell me all about yourself. How is your sister?" "She's well, returned Carrie, answering the last query. He looked at her hard. "Say, he said, you haven't been sick, have you?" Carrie nodded. "Well, now, that's a blooming shame, isn't it? You don't look very well. I thought you looked a little pale. What have you been doing?" "Working, said Carrie. "You don't say so." "At what?" She told him. "Rhodes, Morgenthau and Scott. Why, I know that house. Over here on Fifth Avenue, isn't it?" They were a close-fisted concern. "What made you go there?" "I couldn't get anything else," said Carrie frankly. "Well, that's an outrage," said Druitt. "You oughtn't to be working for those people. Have the factory right back of the store, don't they?" "Yes, said Carrie. "That isn't a good house," said Druitt. "You don't want to work at anything like that, anyhow." He chattered on at a great rate, asking questions, explaining things about himself, telling her what a good restaurant it was, until the waiter returned with an immense tray, bearing the hot savory dishes which had been ordered. Druitt fairly shone in the matter of serving. He appeared to great advantage behind the white napery and silver platters of the table and displaying his arms with a knife and fork. As he cut the meat his rings almost spoke. His new suit creaked as he stretched to reach the plates, break the bread, and pour the coffee. He helped Carrie to a rousing plateful and contributed the warmth of his spirit to her body until she was a new girl. He was a splendid fellow in the true popular understanding of the term, and captivated Carrie completely. That little soldier of fortune took her good turn in an easy way. She felt a little out of place, but the great room soothed her and the view of the well-dressed throng outside seemed a splendid thing. Ah, what was it not to have money? What a thing it was to be able to come in here and dine. Druitt must be fortunate. He rode on trains, dressed in such nice clothes, was so strong, and ate in these fine places. He seemed quite a figure of a man, and she wondered at his friendship and regard for her. "So you lost your place because you got sick, eh?" he said. "What are you going to do now?" Look around, she said, a thought of the need that hung outside this fine restaurant like a hungry dog at her heels passing into her eyes. "Oh, no," said Druitt, "that won't do." "How long have you been looking?" 4 days, she answered. "Think of that!" he said, addressing some problematical individual. "You oughtn't to be doing anything like that. These girls, and he waved an inclusion of all shop and factory girls, don't get anything. Why, you can live on it, can you? He was a brotherly sort of creature in his demeanor. When he had scouted the idea of that kind of toil, he took another tack. Carrie was really very pretty. Even then, in her commonplace garb, her figure was evidently not bad, and her eyes were large and gentle. Druitt looked at her and his thoughts reached home. She felt his admiration. It was powerfully backed by his liberality and good humor. She felt that she liked him, that she could continue to like him ever so much. There was something even richer than that, running as a hidden strain, in her mind. Every little while her eyes would meet his, and by that means the interchanging current of feeling would be fully connected. "Why don't you stay downtown and go to the theater with me?" he said, hitching his chair closer. The table was not very wide. "Oh, I can she said. "What are you going to do tonight?" "Nothing," she answered, a little drearily. "You don't like out there where you are, do you?" "Oh, I don't know. What are you going to do if you don't get work?" "Go back home, I guess." There was the least quaver in her voice as she said this. Somehow, the influence he was exerting was powerful. They came to an understanding of each other without words, he of her situation, she of the fact that he realized it. "No, he said, you can't make it!" Genuine sympathy filling his mind for the time. "Let me help you. You take some of my money." "Oh, no!" she said, leaning back. "What are you going to do?" he said. She sat meditating, merely shaking her head. He looked at her quite tenderly for his kind. There were some loose bills in his vest pocket, greenbacks. They were soft and noiseless, and he got his fingers about them and crumpled them up in his hand. "Come on, he said, I'll see you through all right. Get yourself some clothes." It was the first reference he had made to that subject, and now she realized how bad off she was. In his crude way he had struck the keynote. Her lips trembled a little. She had her hand out on the table before her. They were quite alone in their corner, and he put his larger, warmer hand over it. "Oh, come, Carrie," he said, "what can you do alone? Let me help you." He pressed her hand gently and she tried to withdraw it. At this he held it fast, and she no longer protested. Then he slipped the greenbacks he had into her palm, and when she began to protest, he whispered, "I'll loan it to you. That's all right. I'll loan it to you." He made her take it. She felt bound to him by a strange tie of affection now. They went out, and he walked with her far out south toward Polk Street, talking. "You don't want to live with those people?" he said in one place, abstractedly. Carrie heard it, but it made only a slight impression. "Come down and meet me tomorrow," he said, "and we'll go to the matinee." "Will you?" Carrie protested a while, but acquiesced. "You're not doing anything. Get yourself a nice pair of shoes and a jacket." She scarcely gave a thought to the complication which would trouble her when he was gone. In his presence, she was of his own hopeful, easy way out mood. "Don't you bother about those people out there," he said at parting. "I'll help you." Carrie left him, feeling as though a great arm had slipped out before her to draw off trouble. The money she had accepted was too soft, green, handsome $10 bills. Chapter 7. The lure of the material, beauty speaks for itself. The true meaning of money yet remains to be popularly explained and comprehended. When each individual realizes for himself that this thing primarily stands for and should only be accepted as a moral due, that it should be paid out as honestly stored energy, and not as a usurped privilege, many of our social, religious, and political troubles will have permanently passed. As for Carrie, her understanding of the moral significance of money was the popular understanding, nothing more. The old definition, money, something everybody else has and I must get, would have expressed her understanding of it thoroughly. Some of it she now held in her hand, two soft, green $10 bills, and she felt that she was immensely better off for the having of them. It was something that was power in itself. One of her order of mind would have been content to be cast away upon a desert island with a bundle of money, and only the long strain of starvation would have taught her that in some cases it could have no value. Even then she would have had no conception of the relative value of the thing. Her one thought would, undoubtedly, have concerned the pity of having so much power and the inability to use it. The poor girl thrilled as she walked away from Druitt. She felt ashamed in part because she had been weak enough to take it, but her need was so dire, she was still glad. Now she would have a nice new jacket. Now she would buy a nice pair of pretty button shoes. She would get stockings, too, and a skirt, and until already, as in the matter of her prospective salary, she had got beyond, in her desires, twice the purchasing power of her bills. She conceived a true estimate of Druitt. To her, and indeed to all the world, he was a nice, good-hearted man. There was nothing evil in the fellow. He gave her the money out of a good heart, out of a realization of her want. He would not have given the same amount to a poor young man, but we must not forget that a poor young man could not, in the nature of things, have appealed to him like a poor young girl. Femininity affected his feelings. He was the creature of an inborn desire. Yet no beggar could have caught his eye and said, "My God, mister, I'm starving," but he would gladly have handed out what was considered the proper portion to give beggars and thought no more about it. There would have been no speculation, no philosophizing. He had no mental process in him worthy the dignity of either of those terms. In his good clothes and fine health, he was a merry, unthinking moth of the lamp. Deprived of his position, and struck by a few of the involved and baffling forces which sometimes play upon man, he would have been as helpless as Carrie, as helpless, as non-understanding, as pitiable, if you will, as she. Now, in regard to his pursuit of women, he meant them no harm, because he did not conceive of the relation which he hoped to hold with them as being harmful. He loved to make advances to women, to have them succumb to his charms, not because he was a cold-blooded, dark, scheming villain, but because his inborn desire urged him to that as a chief delight. He was vain, he was boastful, he was as deluded by fine clothes as any silly-headed girl. A truly deep-dyed villain could have hornswaggled him as readily as he could have flattered a pretty shop girl. His fine success as a salesman lay in his geniality and the thoroughly reputable standing of his house. He bobbed about among men, a veritable bundle of enthusiasm, no power worthy the name of intellect, no thoughts worthy the adjective noble, no feelings long continued in one strain. A Madame Sappho would have called him a pig, a Shakespeare would have said my merry child. Old, drinking Carrie thought him a clever, successful businessman. In short, he was as good as his intellect conceived. The best proof that there was something open and commendable about the man was the fact that Carrie took the money. No deep, sinister soul with ulterior motives could have given her 15 cents under the guise of friendship. The unintellectual are not so helpless. Nature has taught the beasts of the field to fly when some unheralded danger threatens. She has put into the small, unwise head of the chipmunk the untutored fear of poisons. He keepeth his creatures whole, was not written of beasts alone. Carrie was unwise, and, therefore, like the sheep in its unwisdom, strong in feeling. The instinct of self-protection, strong in all such natures, was roused but feebly, if at all, by the overtures of Druitt. When Carrie had gone, he felicitated himself upon her good opinion. By George, it was a shame young girls had to be knocked around like that. Cold weather coming on and no clothes. Tough. He would go around to Fitzgerald and Moyes and get a cigar. It made him feel light of foot as he thought about her. Carrie reached home in high good spirits, which she could scarcely conceal. The possession of the money involved a number of points which perplexed her seriously. How should she buy any clothes when Minnie knew that she had no money? She had no sooner entered the flat than this point was settled for her. It could not be done. She could think of no way of explaining. "How did you come out?" asked Minnie, referring to the day. Carrie had none of the small deception which could feel one thing and say something directly opposed. She would prevaricate, but it would be in the line of her feelings at least. So, instead of complaining when she felt so good, she said, "I have the promise of something." "Where?" "At the Boston store." "Is it sure promised?" questioned Minnie. "Well, I'm to find out tomorrow," returned Carrie, disliking to draw out a lie any longer than was necessary. Minnie felt the atmosphere of good feeling which Carrie brought with her. She felt now was the time to express to Carrie the state of Hanson's feeling about her entire Chicago venture. "If you shouldn't get it," she paused, troubled for an easy way. "If I don't get something pretty soon, I think I'll go home." Minnie saw her chance. "Sven thinks it might be best for the winter, anyhow." The situation flashed on Carrie at once. They were unwilling to keep her any longer, out of work. She did not blame Minnie, she did not blame Hanson very much. Now, as she sat there digesting the remark, she was glad she had Druitt's money. "Yes," she said after a few moments, "I thought of doing that." She did not explain that the thought, however, had aroused all the antagonism of her nature. Columbia City, what was there for her? She knew its dull, little round by heart. Here was the great, mysterious city which was still a magnet for her. What she had seen only suggested its possibilities. Now to turn back on it and live the little old life out there, she almost exclaimed against the thought. She had reached home early and went in the front room to think. What could she do? She could not buy new shoes and wear them here. She would need to save part of the 20 to pay her fare home. She did not want to borrow of Minnie for that. And yet, how could she explain where she even got that money? If she could only get enough to let her out easy. She went over the tangle again and again. Here, in the morning, Druitt would expect to see her in a new jacket, and that couldn't be. The Hansons expected her to go home, and she wanted to get away, and yet she did not want to go home. In the light of the way they would look on her getting money without work, the taking of it now seemed dreadful. She began to be ashamed. The whole situation depressed her. It was all so clear when she was with Druitt. Now it was all so tangled, so hopeless, much worse than it was before, because she had the semblance of aid in her hand which she could not use. Her spirits sank so that at supper Minnie felt that she must have had another hard day. Carrie finally decided that she would give the money back. It was wrong to take it. She would go down in the morning and hunt for work. At noon she would meet Druitt as agreed and tell him. At this decision her heart sank, until she was the old Carrie of distress. Curiously, she could not hold the money in her hand without feeling some relief. Even after all her depressing conclusions, she could sweep away all thought about the matter, and then the $20 seemed a wonderful and delightful thing. Ah, money, money, money. What a thing it was to have. How plenty of it would clear away all these troubles. In the morning she got up and started out a little early. Her decision to hunt for work was moderately strong, but the money in her pocket, after all her troubling over it, made the work question the least shade less terrible. She walked into the wholesale district, but as the thought of applying came with each passing concern, her heart shrank. What a coward she was, she thought to herself. Yet she had applied so often. It would be the same old story. She walked on, and finally did go into one place, with the old result. She came out feeling that luck was against her. It was no use. Without much thinking, she reached Dearborn Street. Here was the great fair store with its multitude of delivery wagons about, its long window display, its crowd of shoppers. It readily changed her thoughts, she who was so weary of them. It was here that she had intended to come and get her new things. Now for relief from distress, she thought she would go in and see. She would look at the jackets. There is nothing in this world more delightful than that middle state in which we mentally balance at times, possessed of the means, lured by desire, and yet deterred by conscience or want of decision. When Carrie began wandering around the store amid the fine displays, she was in this mood. Her original experience in this same place had given her a high opinion of its merits. Now she paused at each individual bit of finery, where before she had hurried on. Her woman's heart was warm with desire for them. How would she look in this? How charming that would make her. She came upon the corset counter and paused in rich reverie as she noted the dainty concoctions of color and lace there displayed. If she would only make up her mind, she could have one of those now. She lingered in the jewelry department. She saw the earrings, the bracelets, the pins, the chains. What would she not have given if she could have had them all? She would look fine too, if only she had some of these things. The jackets were the greatest attraction. When she entered the store, she already had her heart fixed upon the peculiar little tan jacket with large mother-of-pearl buttons which was all the rage that fall. Still she delighted to convince herself that there was nothing she would like better. She went about among the glass cases and racks where these things were displayed, and satisfied herself that the one she thought of was the proper one. All the time she wavered in mind, now persuading herself that she could buy it right away if she chose, now recalling to herself the actual condition. At last the noon hour was dangerously near, and she had done nothing. She must go now and return the money. Druitt was on the corner when she came up. "Hello," he said, "where is the jacket?" and, looking down the shoes. Carrie had thought to lead up to her decision in some intelligent way, but this swept the whole foreschemed situation by the board. "I came to tell you that I can't take the money." "Oh, that's it, is it?" he returned. "Well, you come on with me. Let's go over here to Partridge's." Carrie walked with him. Behold, the whole fabric of doubt and impossibility had slipped from her mind. She could not get at the points that were so serious, the things she was going to make plain to him. "Have you had lunch yet?" "Of course you haven't. Let's go in here," and Druitt turned into one of the very nicely furnished restaurants off State Street, in Monroe. "I mustn't take the money," said Carrie, after they were settled in a cozy corner, and Druitt had ordered the lunch. "I can't wear those things out there. They wouldn't know where I got them." "What do you want to do?" he smiled. "Go without them?" "I think I'll go home," she said, wearily. "Oh, come," he said, "you've been thinking it over too long. I'll tell you what you do. You say you can't wear them out there. Why don't you rent a furnished room and leave them in that for a week?" Carrie shook her head. Like all women, she was there to object and be convinced. It was for him to brush the doubts away and clear the path if he could. "Why are you going home?" he asked. "Oh, I can't get anything here." "They won't keep you?" he remarked, intuitively. "They can't," said Carrie. "I'll tell you what you do," he said. "You come with me. I'll take care of you." Carrie heard this passively. The peculiar state which she was in made it sound like the welcome breath of an open door. Druitt seemed of her own spirit and pleasing. He was clean, handsome, well-dressed, and sympathetic. His voice was the voice of a friend, What can you do back at Columbia City? He went on, rousing by the words in Carrie's mind a picture of the dull world she had left. There isn't anything down there. Chicago's the place. You can get a nice room here and some clothes, and then you can do something. Carrie looked out through the window into the busy street. There it was, the admirable, great city, so fine when you are not poor. An elegant coach, with a prancing pair of bays, passed by, carrying in its upholstered depths a young lady. "What will you have if you go back?" asked Druitt. There was no subtle undercurrent to the question. He imagined that she would have nothing at all of the things he thought worthwhile. Carrie sat still, looking out. She was wondering what she could do. They would be expecting her to go home this week. Druitt turned to the subject of the clothes she was going to buy. "Why not get yourself a nice little jacket? You've got to have it. I'll loan you the money. You needn't worry about taking it. You can get yourself a nice room by yourself. I won't hurt you." Carrie saw the drift, but could not express her thoughts. She felt more than ever the helplessness of her case. "If I could only get something to do," she said. "Maybe you can," went on Druitt, "if you stay here. You can't if you go away. They won't let you stay out there. Now, why not let me get you a nice room? I won't bother you, you needn't be afraid. Then, when you get fixed up, maybe you could get something." He looked at her pretty face and it vivified his mental resources. She was a sweet little mortal to him, there was no doubt of that. She seemed to have some power back of her actions. She was not like the common run of store girls. She wasn't silly. In reality, Carrie had more imagination than he, more taste. It was a finer mental strain in her that made possible her depression and loneliness. Her poor clothes were neat, and she held her head unconsciously in a dainty way. "Do you think I could get something?" she asked. "Sure," he said, reaching over and filling her cup with tea. "I'll help you." She looked at him, and he laughed reassuringly. "Now I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll go over here to Partridge's and you pick out what you want. Then we'll look around for a room for you. You can leave the things there. Then we'll go to the show tonight." Carrie shook her head. "Well, you can go out to the flat then, that's all right. You don't need to stay in the room. Just take it and leave your things there." She hung in doubt about this until the dinner was over. "Let's go over and look at the jackets," he said. Together they went. In the store they found that shine and rustle of new things which immediately laid hold of Carrie's heart. Under the influence of a good dinner and Druitt's radiating presence, the scheme proposed seemed feasible. She looked about and picked a jacket like the one which she had admired at the fair. When she got it in her hand it seemed so much nicer. The saleswoman helped her on with it, and, by accident, it fitted perfectly. Druitt's face lightened as he saw the improvement. She looked quite smart. "That's the thing," he said. Carrie turned before the glass. She could not help feeling pleased as she looked at herself. A warm glow crept into her cheeks. "That's the thing," said Druitt. "Now pay for it." "It's $9, said Carrie. "That's all right, take it," said Druitt. She reached in her purse and took out one of the bills. The woman asked if she would wear the coat and went off. In a few minutes she was back and the purchase was closed. From Partridge's they went to a shoe store, where Carrie was fitted for shoes. Druitt stood by, and when he saw how nice they looked, said, "Wear them." Carrie shook her head, however. She was thinking of returning to the flat. He bought her a purse for one thing, and a pair of gloves for another, and let her buy the stockings. "Tomorrow," he said, "you come down here and buy yourself a skirt." In all of Carrie's actions there was a touch of misgiving. The deeper she sank into the entanglement, the more she imagined that the thing hung upon the few remaining things she had not done. Since she had not done these, there was a way out. Druitt knew a place in Wabash Avenue where there were rooms. He showed Carrie the outside of these, and said, "Now, you're my sister." He carried the arrangement off with an easy hand when it came to the selection, looking around, criticizing, opining. "Her trunk will be here in a day or so," he observed to the landlady, who was very pleased. When they were alone, Druitt did not change in the least. He talked in the same general way as if they were out in the street. Carrie left her things. "Now," said Druitt, "why don't you move tonight?" "Oh, I can't," said Carrie. "Why not?" "I don't want to leave them so." He took that up as they walked along the avenue. It was a warm afternoon. The sun had come out and the wind had died down. As he talked with Carrie, he secured an accurate detail of the atmosphere of the flat. "Come out of it," he said, "they won't care. I'll help you get along." She listened until her misgivings vanished. He would show her about a little and then help her get something. He really imagined that he would. He would be out on the road and she could be working. "Now, I'll tell you what you do," he said, "you go out there and get whatever you want and come away." She thought a long time about this. Finally she agreed. He would come out as far as Peoria Street and wait for her. She was to meet him at 8:30. At 5:30 she reached home, and at 6 her determination was hardened. "So you didn't get it?" said Minnie, referring to Carrie's story of the Boston store. Carrie looked at her out of the corner of her eye. "No," she answered. "I don't think you'd better try any more this fall," said Minnie. Carrie said nothing. When Hanson came home he wore the same inscrutable demeanor. He washed in silence and went off to read his paper. At dinner Carrie felt a little nervous. The strain of her own plans was considerable, and the feeling that she was not welcome here was strong. "Didn't find anything, eh?" said Hanson. "No." He turned to his eating again, the thought that it was a burden to have her here dwelling in his mind. She would have to go home, that was all. Once she was away, there would be no more coming back in the spring. Carrie was afraid of what she was going to do, but she was relieved to know that this condition was ending. They would not care. Hanson particularly would be glad when she went. He would not care what became of her. After dinner she went into the bathroom, where they could not disturb her, and wrote a little note. "Goodbye, Minnie," it read. "I'm not going home. I'm going to stay in Chicago a little while and look for work. Don't worry. I'll be all right." In the front room Hanson was reading his paper. As usual, she helped Minnie clear away the dishes and straighten up. Then she said, "I guess I'll stand down at the door a little while." She could scarcely prevent her voice from trembling. Minnie remembered Hanson's remonstrance. "Sven doesn't think it looks good to stand down there," she said. "Doesn't he?" said Carrie. "I won't do it any more after this." She put on her hat and fidgeted around the table in the little bedroom, wondering where to slip the note. Finally she put it under Minnie's hairbrush. When she had closed the hall door, she paused a moment and wondered what they would think. Some thought of the queerness of her deed affected her. She went slowly down the stairs. She looked back up the lighted step, and then affected to stroll up the street. When she reached the corner she quickened her pace. As she was hurrying away, Hanson came back to his wife. "Is Carrie down at the door again?" he asked. "Yes," said Minnie, "she said she wasn't going to do it anymore." He went over to the baby where it was playing on the floor and began to poke his finger at it. Druitt was on the corner waiting, in good spirits. "Hello, Carrie," he said, as a sprightly figure of a girl drew near him. "Got here safe, did you? Well, we'll take a car." Chapter 8. Intimations by Winter, an ambassador summoned. Among the forces which sweep and play throughout the universe, untutored man is but a wisp in the wind. Our civilization is still in a middle stage, scarcely beast, in that it is no longer wholly guided by instinct, scarcely human, in that it is not yet wholly guided by reason. On the tiger no responsibility rests. We see him aligned by nature with the forces of life, he is born into their keeping and without thought he is protected. We see man far removed from the lairs of the jungles, his innate instincts dulled by too near an approach to free will, his free will not sufficiently developed to replace his instincts and afford him perfect guidance. He is becoming too wise to hearken always to instincts and desires, he is still too weak to always prevail against them. As a beast, the forces of life aligned him with them; as a man, he has not yet wholly learned to align himself with the forces. In this intermediate stage he wavers, neither drawn in harmony with nature by his instincts nor yet wisely putting himself into harmony by his own free will. He is even as a wisp in the wind, moved by every breath of passion, acting now by his will and now by his instincts, erring with one, only to retrieve by the other, falling by one, only to rise by the other, a creature of incalculable variability. We have the consolation of knowing that evolution is ever in action, that the ideal is a light that cannot fail. He will not forever balance thus between good and evil. When this jangle of free will and instinct shall have been adjusted, when perfect understanding has given the former the power to replace the latter entirely, man will no longer vary. The needle of understanding will yet point steadfast and unwavering to the distant pole of truth. In Carrie, as in how many of our worldlings, do they not ? Instinct and reason, desire and understanding, were at war for the mastery. She followed whither her craving led. She was as yet more drawn than she drew. When Minnie found the note next morning, after a night of mingled wonder and anxiety, which was not exactly touched by yearning, sorrow, or love, she exclaimed, "Well, what do you think of that ? What ? said Hanson. "Sister Carrie has gone to live somewhere else." Hanson jumped out of bed with more celerity than he usually displayed and looked at the note. The only indication of his thoughts came in the form of a little clicking sound made by his tongue, the sound some people make when they wish to urge on a horse. "Where do you suppose she's gone to ? Said Minnie, thoroughly aroused. "I don't know, a touch of cynicism lighting his eye. "Now she has gone and done it." Minnie moved her head in a puzzled way. Oh, she said, "she doesn't know what she has done." "Well, said Hanson, after a while, sticking his hands out before him, "what can you do ? Minnie's womanly nature was higher than this. She figured the possibilities in such cases. "Oh, she said at last, "poor Sister Carrie!" At the time of this particular conversation, which occurred at 5 a.m., that little soldier of fortune was sleeping a rather troubled sleep in her new room, alone. Carrie's new state was remarkable in that she saw possibilities in it. She was no sensualist, longing to drowse sleepily in the lap of luxury. She turned about, troubled by her daring, glad of her release, wondering whether she would get something to do, wondering what Druitt would do. That worthy had his future fixed for him beyond a peradventure. He could not help what he was going to do. He could not see clearly enough to wish to do differently. He was drawn by his innate desire to act the old pursuing part. He would need to delight himself with Carrie as surely as he would need to eat his heavy breakfast. He might suffer the least rudimentary twinge of conscience in whatever he did, and in just so far he was evil and sinning. But whatever twinges of conscience he might have would be rudimentary, you may be sure. The next day he called upon Carrie, and she saw him in her chamber. He was the same jolly, enlivening soul. "Ah, he said, "what are you looking so blue about? Come on out to breakfast. You want to get your other clothes today." Carrie looked at him with the hue of shifting thought in her large eyes. "I wish I could get something to do, she said. "You'll get that all right, said Druitt. "What's the use worrying right now? Get yourself fixed up. See the city. I won't hurt you. "I know you won't, she remarked, half truthfully. "Got on the new shoes, haven't you? Stick 'em out. George, they look fine. Put on your jacket." Carrie obeyed. "Say, that fits like a T, don't it? He remarked, feeling the set of it at the waist and eyeing it from a few paces with real pleasure. "What you need now is a new skirt. Let us go to breakfast." Carrie put on her hat. "Where are the gloves? He inquired. "Here, she said, taking them out of the bureau drawer. "Now, come on, he said. Thus the first hour of misgiving was swept away. It went this way on every occasion. Druitt did not leave her much alone. She had time for some lone wanderings, but mostly he filled her hours with sightseeing. At Carson, Furious, he bought her a nice skirt and shirtwaist. With his money she purchased the little necessaries of toilet, until at last she looked quite another maiden. The mirror convinced her of a few things which she had long believed. She was pretty, yes, indeed. How nice her hat sat, and weren't her eyes pretty? She caught her little red lip with her teeth and felt her first thrill of power. Druitt was so good. They went to see The Mikado one evening, an opera which was hilariously popular at that time. Before going, they made off for the Windsor dining room, which was in Dearborn Street, a considerable distance from Carrie's room. It was blowing up cold, and out of her window Carrie could see the western sky, still pink with the fading light, but steely blue at the top where it met the darkness. A long, thin cloud of pink hung in midair, shaped like some island in a far-off sea. Somehow the swaying of some dead branches of trees across the way brought back the picture with which she was familiar when she looked from their front window in December days at home. She paused and wrung her little hands. "What's the matter?" said Druitt. "Oh, I don't know," she said, her lip trembling. He sensed something, and slipped his arm over her shoulder, patting her arm. "Come on," he said gently, "you're all right." She turned to slip on her jacket. "Better wear that boa about her throat tonight." They walked north on Wabash to Adams Street and then west. The lights in the stores were already shining out in gushes of golden hue. The arc lights were sputtering overhead, and high up were the lighted windows of the tall office buildings. The chill wind whipped in and out in gusty breaths. Homeward bound, the 6 o'clock throng bumped and jostled. Light overcoats were turned up about the ears, hats were pulled down. Little shop girls went fluttering by in pairs and fours, chattering, laughing. It was a spectacle of warm-blooded humanity. Suddenly a pair of eyes met Carrie's in recognition. They were looking out from a group of poorly dressed girls. Their clothes were faded and loose-hanging, their jackets old, their general makeup shabby. Carrie recognized the glance and the girl. She was one of those who worked at the machines in the shoe factory. The latter looked, not quite sure, and then turned her head and looked. Carrie felt as if some great tide had rolled between them. The old dress and the old machine came back. She actually started. Druitt didn't notice until Carrie bumped into a pedestrian. "You must be thinking," he said. They dined and went to the theater. That spectacle pleased Carrie immensely. The color and grace of it caught her eye. She had vain imaginings about place and power, about far-off lands and magnificent people. When it was over, the clatter of coaches and the throng of fine ladies made her stare. "Wait a minute," said Druitt, holding her back in the showy foyer where ladies and gentlemen were moving in a social crush, skirts rustling, lace-covered heads nodding, white teeth showing through parted lips. "Let us see." 67, the coach caller was saying, his voice lifted in a sort of euphonious cry. 67. "Isn't it fine?" said Carrie. "Great," said Druitt. He was as much affected by this show of finery and gaiety as she. He pressed her arm warmly. Once she looked up, her even teeth glistening through her smiling lips, her eyes alight. As they were moving out he whispered down to her, "You look lovely!" They were right where the coach caller was swinging open a coach door and ushering in two ladies. "You stick to me and we'll have a coach," laughed Druitt. Carrie scarcely heard, her head was so full of the swirl of life. They stopped in at a restaurant for a little after theater lunch. Just a shade of a thought of the hour entered Carrie's head, but there was no household law to govern her now. If any habits ever had time to fix upon her, they would have operated here. Habits are peculiar things. They will drive the really non-religious mind out of bed to say prayers that are only a custom and not a devotion. The victim of habit, when he has neglected the thing which it was his custom to do, feels a little scratching in the brain, a little irritating something which comes of being out of the rut, and imagines it to be the prick of conscience, the still, small voice that is urging him ever to righteousness. If the digression is unusual enough, the drag of habit will be heavy enough to cause the unreasoning victim to return and perform the perfunctory thing. Now, bless me, says such a mind, I have done my duty, when, as a matter of fact, it has merely done its old, unbreakable trick once again. Carrie had no excellent home principles fixed upon her. If she had, she would have been more consciously distressed. Now the lunch went off with considerable warmth. Under the influence of the varied occurrences, the fine, invisible passion which was emanating from Druitt, the food, the still unusual luxury, she relaxed and heard with open ears. She was again the victim of the city's hypnotic influence. "Well, said Druitt at last, we had better be going." They had been dawdling over the dishes, and their eyes had frequently met. Carrie could not help but feel the vibration of force which followed, which, indeed, was his gaze. He had a way of touching her hand in explanation, as if to impress a fact upon her. He touched it now as he spoke of going. They arose and went out into the street. The downtown section was now bare, save for a few whistling strollers, a few cars, a few open resorts whose windows were still bright. Out Wabash Avenue they strolled, Druitt still pouring forth his volume of small information. He had Carrie's arm in his, and held it closely as he explained. Once in a while, after some witticism, he would look down, and his eyes would meet hers. At last they came to the steps, and Carrie stood up on the first one, her head now coming even with his own. He took her hand and held it genially. He looked steadily at her as she glanced about, warmly musing. At about that hour, Minnie was soundly sleeping, after a long evening of troubled thought. She had her elbow in an awkward position under her side. The muscles so held irritated a few nerves, and now a vague scene floated in on the drowsy mind. She fancied she and Carrie were somewhere beside an old coal mine. She could see the tall runway and the heap of earth and coal cast out. There was a deep pit, into which they were looking. They could see the curious whetstones far down where the wall disappeared in vague shadows. An old basket, used for descending, was hanging there, fastened by a worn rope. "Let us get in, said Carrie. "Oh, no, said Minnie. "Yes, come on, said Carrie. She began to pull the basket over, and now, in spite of all protest, she had swung over and was going down. "Carrie, she called, "Carrie, come back, but Carrie was far down now and the shadow had swallowed her completely. She moved her arm. Now the mystic scenery merged queerly and the place was by waters she had never seen. They were upon some board or ground or something that reached far out, and at the end of this was Carrie. They looked about, and now the thing was sinking, and Minnie heard the low sip of the encroaching water. "Come on, Carrie, she called, but Carrie was reaching farther out. She seemed to recede, and now it was difficult to call to her. "Carrie, she called, Carrie, but her own voice sounded far away, and the strange waters were blurring everything. She came away suffering as though she had lost something. She was more inexpressibly sad than she had even been in life. It was this way through many shifts of the tired brain, those curious phantoms of the spirit slipping in, blurring strange scenes, one with the other. The last one made her cry out, for Carrie was slipping away somewhere over a rock, and her fingers had let loose and she had seen her falling. "Minnie. What's the matter? Here, wake up, said Hanson, disturbed, and shaking her by the shoulder. "Well, what's the matter? Said Minnie, drowsily. "Wake up, he said, and turn over. You talking in your sleep." A week or so later Druitt strolled into Fitzgerald and Moyes, spruce in dress and manner. "Hello, Charlie, said Hurstwood, looking out from his office door. Druitt strolled over and looked in upon the manager at his desk. "When do you go out on the road again? He inquired. "Pretty soon, said Druitt. "Haven't seen much of you this trip, said Hurstwood. "Well, I've been busy, said Druitt. They talked some few minutes on general topics. "Say, said Druitt, as if struck by a sudden idea, I want you to come out some evening. Out where? Inquired Hurstwood. "Out to my house, of course, said Druitt, smiling. Hurstwood looked up quizzically, the least suggestion of a smile hovering about his lips. He studied the face of Druitt in his wise way, and then with the demeanor of a gentleman, said, "Certainly, Glad to. We'll have a nice game of euchre. May I bring a nice little bottle of sec? Asked Hurstwood. Certainly, said Druitt. I'll introduce you. Chapter 9. Convention's own tinderbox, the eye that is green. Hurstwood's residence on the north side, near Lincoln Park, was a brick building of a very popular type then, a 3-story affair with the first floor sunk a very little below the level of the street. It had a large bay window bulging out from the second floor, and was graced in front by a small grassy plot, 25 feet wide and 10 feet deep. There was also a small rear yard, walled in by the fences of the neighbors and holding a stable where he kept his horse and trap. The 10 rooms of the house were occupied by himself, his wife Julia, and his son and daughter, George Jr., and Jessica. There were besides these a maidservant, represented from time to time by girls of various extraction, for Mrs. Hurstwood was not always easy to please. "George, I let Mary go yesterday," was not an unfrequent salutation at the dinner table. "All right," was his only reply. He had long since wearied of discussing the rancorous subject. A lovely home atmosphere is one of the flowers of the world, than which there is nothing more tender, nothing more delicate, nothing more calculated to make strong and just the natures cradled and nourished within it. Those who have never experienced such a beneficent influence will not understand wherefore the tear springs glistening to the eyelids at some strange breath in lovely music. The mystic chords which bind and thrill the heart of the nation, they will never know. Hurstwood's residence could scarcely be said to be infused with this home spirit. It lacked that toleration and regard without which the home is nothing. There was fine furniture, arranged as soothingly as the artistic perception of the occupants warranted. There were soft rugs, rich, upholstered chairs and divans, a grand piano, a marble carving of some unknown Venus by some unknown artist, and a number of small bronzes gathered from heaven knows where, but generally sold by the large furniture houses along with everything else which goes to make the perfectly appointed house. In the dining room stood a sideboard laden with glistening decanters and other utilities and ornaments in glass, the arrangement of which could not be questioned. Here was something Hurstwood knew about. He had studied the subject for years in his business. He took no little satisfaction in telling each Mary, shortly after she arrived, something of what the art of the thing required. He was not garrulous by any means. On the contrary, there was a fine reserve in his manner toward the entire domestic economy of his life which was all that is comprehended by the popular term, gentlemanly. He would not argue, he would not talk freely. In his manner was something of the dogmatist. What he could not correct, he would ignore. There was a tendency in him to walk away from the impossible thing. There was a time when he had been considerably enamored of his Jessica, especially when he was younger and more confined in his success. Now, however, in her 17th year, Jessica had developed a certain amount of reserve and independence which was not inviting to the richest form of parental devotion. She was in the high school, and had notions of life which were decidedly those of a patrician. She liked nice clothes and urged for them constantly. Thoughts of love and elegant individual establishments were running in her head. She met girls at the high school whose parents were truly rich and whose fathers had standing locally as partners or owners of solid businesses. These girls gave themselves the airs befitting the thriving domestic establishments from whence they issued. They were the only ones of the school about whom Jessica concerned herself. Young Hurstwood Jr. was in his 20th year, and was already connected in a promising capacity with a large real estate firm. He contributed nothing for the domestic expenses of the family, but was thought to be saving his money to invest in real estate. He had some ability, considerable vanity, and a love of pleasure that had not, as yet, infringed upon his duties, whatever they were. He came in and went out, pursuing his own plans and fancies, addressing a few words to his mother occasionally, relating some little incident to his father, but for the most part confining himself to those generalities with which most conversation concerns itself. He was not laying bare his desires for anyone to see. He did not find anyone in the house who particularly cared to see. Mrs. Hurstwood was the type of the woman who has ever endeavored to shine and has been more or less chagrined at the evidences of superior capability in this direction elsewhere. Her knowledge of life extended to that little conventional round of society of which she was not but longed to be a member. She was not without realization already that this thing was impossible, so far as she was concerned. For her daughter, she hoped better things. Through Jessica she might rise a little. Through George Jr.'s possible success she might draw to herself the privilege of pointing proudly. Even Hurstwood was doing well enough, and she was anxious that his small real estate adventures should prosper. His property holdings, as yet, were rather small, but his income was pleasing and his position with Fitzgerald and Moy was fixed. Both those gentlemen were on pleasant and rather informal terms with him. The atmosphere which such personalities would create must be apparent to all. It worked out in 1,000 little conversations, all of which were of the same caliber. "I am going up to Fox Lake tomorrow," announced George Jr., at the dinner table one Friday evening. "What's going on up there?" queried Mrs. Hurstwood. "Eddie Fairway's got a new steam launch, and he wants me to come up and see how it works. How much did it cost him?" asked his mother. "Oh, over $2,000. He says it's a dandy. Old Fairway must be making money, put in Hurstwood. "He is, I guess. Jack told me they were shipping Vega Kiro to Australia. Knows they sent a whole box to Cape Town last week. Just think of that!" said Mrs. Hurstwood, "and only 4 years ago they had that basement in Madison Street. Jack told me they were going to put up a 6-story building next spring in Robie Street. Just think of that!" said Jessica. On this particular occasion Hurstwood wished to leave early. "I guess I'll be going downtown," he remarked, rising. "Are we going to McVicker's Monday?" questioned Mrs. Hurstwood, without rising. "Yes, he said indifferently. They went on dining, while he went upstairs for his hat and coat. Presently the door clicked. "I guess Papa's gone," said Jessica. The latter's school news was of a particular stripe. "They were going to give a performance in the Lyceum, upstairs," she reported one day, "and I am going to be in it." "Are you?" said her mother. "Yes, and I'll have to have a new dress. Some of the nicest girls in the school are going to be in it. Miss Palmer is going to take the part of Portia." "Is she?" said Mrs. Hurstwood. "They've got that Martha Griswold in it again. She thinks she can act. Her family doesn't amount to anything, does it?" said Mrs. Hurstwood sympathetically. "They haven't anything, have they?" "No," returned Jessica. "They report as church mice." She distinguished very carefully between the young boys of the school, many of whom were attracted by her beauty. "What do you think?" she remarked to her mother one evening, "that Herbert Crane tried to make friends with me." "Who is he, my dear?" inquired Mrs. Hurstwood. "Oh, no one," said Jessica, pursing her pretty lips. "He's just a student there. He hasn't anything." The other half of this picture came when young Blyford, son of Blyford, the soap manufacturer, walked home with her. Mrs. Hurstwood was on the 3rd floor, sitting in a rocking chair reading, and happened to look out at the time. "Who was that with you, Jessica?" she inquired, as Jessica came upstairs. "It's Mr. Blyford, Mama," she replied. "Is it?" said Mrs. Hurstwood. "Yes, and he wants me to stroll over into the park with him," explained Jessica, a little flushed with running up the stairs. "All right, my dear," said Mrs. Hurstwood. "Don't be gone long." As the two went down the street, she glanced interestedly out of the window. It was a most satisfactory spectacle indeed, most satisfactory. In this atmosphere Hurstwood had moved for a number of years, not thinking deeply concerning it. His was not the order of nature to trouble for something better, unless the better was immediately and sharply contrasted. As it was, he received and gave, irritated sometimes by the little displays of selfish indifference, pleased at times by some show of finery which supposedly made for dignity and social distinction. The life of the resort which he managed was his life. There he spent most of his time. When he went home evenings the house looked nice. With rare exceptions the meals were acceptable, being the kind that an ordinary servant can arrange. In part, he was interested in the talk of his son and daughter, who always looked well. The vanity of Mrs. Hurstwood caused her to keep her person rather showily arrayed, but to Hurstwood this was much better than plainness. There was no love lost between them. There was no great feeling of dissatisfaction. Her opinion on any subject was not startling. They did not talk enough together to come to the argument of any one point. In the accepted and popular phrase, she had her ideas and he had his. Once in a while he would meet a woman whose youth, sprightliness, and humor would make his wife seem rather deficient by contrast, but the temporary dissatisfaction which such an encounter might arouse would be counterbalanced by his social position and a certain matter of policy. He could not complicate his home life, because it might affect his relations with his employers. They wanted no scandals. A man, to hold his position, must have a dignified manner, a clean record, a respectable home anchorage. Therefore he was circumspect in all he did, and whenever he appeared in the public ways in the afternoon, or on Sunday, it was with his wife, and sometimes his children. He would visit the local resorts, or those nearby in Wisconsin, and spend a few stiff, polished days strolling about conventional places doing conventional things. He knew the need of it. When some one of the many middle-class individuals whom he knew, who had money, would get into trouble, he would shake his head. It didn't he do to talk about those things. If it came up for discussion among such friends as with him passed for close, he would deprecate the folly of the thing. It was all right to do it, all men do those things, but why wasn't he careful? A man can't be too careful. He lost sympathy for the man that made a mistake and was found out. On this account he still devoted some time to showing his wife about time, which would have been wearisome indeed if it had not been for the people he would meet and the little enjoyments which did not depend upon her presence or absence. He watched her with considerable curiosity at times, for she was still attractive in a way and men looked at her. She was affable, vain, subject to flattery, and this combination, he knew quite well, might produce a tragedy in a woman of her home position. Owing to his order of mind, his confidence in the sex was not great. His wife never possessed the virtues which would win the confidence and admiration of a man of his nature. As long as she loved him vigorously he could see how confidence could be, but when that was no longer the binding chain, well, something might happen. During the last year or two the expenses of the family seemed a large thing. Jessica wanted fine clothes, and Mrs. Hurstwood, not to be outshone by her daughter, also frequently enlivened her apparel. Hurstwood had said nothing in the past, but one day he murmured, "Jessica must have a new dress this month," said Mrs. Hurstwood one morning. Hurstwood was arraying himself in one of his perfection vests before the glass at the time. "I thought she just bought one," he said. "That was just something for evening wear," returned his wife complacently. "It seems to me," returned Hurstwood, "that she's spending a good deal for dresses of late. Well, she's going out more," concluded his wife, but the tone of his voice impressed her as containing something she had not heard there before. He was not a man who traveled much, but when he did, he had been accustomed to take her along. On one occasion recently a local aldermanic junket had been arranged to visit Philadelphia, a junket that was to last 10 days. Hurstwood had been invited. "Nobody knows us down there," said one, a gentleman whose face was a slight improvement over gross ignorance and sensuality. He always wore a silk hat of most imposing proportions. "We can have a good time." His left eye moved with just the semblance of a wink. "You want to come along, George?" The next day Hurstwood announced his intention to his wife. "I am going away, Julia," he said, "for a few days." "Where?" she asked, looking up. "To Philadelphia, on business." She looked at him consciously, expecting something else. "I'll have to leave you behind this time." "All right," she replied, but he could see that she was thinking that it was a curious thing. Before he went she asked him a few more questions, and that irritated him. He began to feel that she was a disagreeable attachment. On this trip he enjoyed himself thoroughly, and when it was over he was sorry to get back. He was not willingly a prevaricator, and hated thoroughly to make explanations concerning it. The whole incident was glossed over with general remarks, but Mrs. Hurstwood gave the subject considerable thought. She drove out more, dressed better, and attended theaters freely to make up for it. Such an atmosphere could hardly come under the category of home life. It ran along by force of habit, by force of conventional opinion. With the lapse of time it must necessarily become drier, and drier must eventually be tinder, easily lighted and destroyed. Chapter 10. The Council of Winter, Fortune's Ambassador calls. In the light of the world's attitude toward woman and her duties, the nature of Carrie's mental state deserves consideration. Actions such as hers are measured by an arbitrary scale. Society possesses a conventional standard whereby it judges all things. All men should be good, all women virtuous. Wherefore, villain, hast thou failed? For all the liberal analysis of Spencer and our modern naturalistic philosophers, we have but an infantile perception of morals. There is more in the subject than mere conformity to a law of evolution. It is yet deeper than conformity to things of earth alone. It is more involved than we, as yet, perceive. Answer: first, why the heart thrills, explain wherefore some plaintive note goes wandering about the world, undying, make clear the rose's subtle alchemy evolving its ruddy lamp in light and rain. In the essence of these facts lie the first principles of morals. O, thought Druitt, how delicious is my conquest. Thought Carrie, with mournful misgivings, what is it I have lost? Before this world-old proposition we stand, serious, interested, confused, endeavoring to evolve the true theory of morals, the true answer to what is right. In the view of a certain stratum of society, Carrie was comfortably established in the eyes of the starveling, beaten by every wind and gusty sheet of rain. She was safe in a halcyon harbor. Druitt had taken 3 rooms, furnished, in Ogden Place, facing Union Park, on the west side. That was a little, green-carpeted breathing spot, than which, today, there is nothing more beautiful in Chicago. It afforded a vista pleasant to contemplate. The best room looked out upon the lawn of the park, now sere and brown, where a little lake lay sheltered. Over the bare limbs of the trees, which now swayed in the wintry wind, rose the steeple of the Union Park Congregational Church, and far off the towers of several others. The rooms were comfortably enough furnished. There was a good Brussels carpet on the floor, rich in dull red and lemon shades, and representing large jardinières filled with gorgeous, impossible flowers. There was a large beer-glass mirror between the 2 windows. A large, soft, green, plush-covered couch occupied one corner, and several rocking chairs were set about. Some pictures, several rugs, a few small pieces of bric-a-brac, and the tale of contents is told. In the bedroom, off the front room, was Carrie's trunk, bought by Druitt, and in the wardrobe built into the wall quite an array of clothing more than she had ever possessed before, and of very becoming designs. There was a 3rd room for possible use as a kitchen, where Druitt had Carrie establish a little portable gas stove for the preparation of small lunches, oysters, Welsh rarebits, and the like, of which he was exceedingly fond, and, lastly, a bath. The whole place was cozy, in that it was lighted by gas and heated by furnace registers, possessing also a small grate, set with an asbestos back, a method of cheerful warming which was then first coming into use. By her industry and natural love of order, which now developed, the place maintained an air pleasing in the extreme. Here, then, was Carrie, established in a pleasant fashion, free of certain difficulties which most ominously confronted her, laden with many new ones which were of a mental order, and altogether so turned about in all of her earthly relationships that she might well have been a new and different individual. She looked into her glass and saw a prettier Carrie than she had seen before. She looked into her mind, a mirror prepared of her own and the world's opinions, and saw a worse. Between these 2 images she wavered, hesitating which to believe. My, "But you real little beauty," Druitt was wont to exclaim to her. She would look at him with large, pleased eyes. "You know it, don't you?" He would continue. "Oh, I don't know," she would reply, feeling delight in the fact that one should think so, hesitating to believe, though she really did, that she was vain enough to think so much of herself. Her conscience, however, was not Druitt, interested to praise. There she heard a different voice, with which she argued, pleaded, excused. It was no just and sapient counselor, in its last analysis. It was only an average little conscience, a thing which represented the world, her past environment, habit, convention, in a confused way. With it, the voice of the people was truly the voice of God. "Oh, thou failure!" said the voice. "Why?" she questioned. "Look at those about, came the whispered answer. "Look at those who are good. How would they scorn to do what you have done? Look at the good girls, how will they draw away from such as you when they know you have been weak? You had not tried before you failed." It was when Carrie was alone, looking out across the park, that she would be listening to this. It would come infrequently when something else did not interfere, when the pleasant side was not too apparent, when Druitt was not there. It was somewhat clear in utterance at first, but never wholly convincing. There was always an answer, always. The December days threatened. She was alone, she was desertful, she was fearful of the whistling wind. The voice of want made answer for her. Once the bright days of summer pass by, a city takes on that somber garb of gray, wrapped in which it goes about its labors during the long winter. Its endless buildings look gray, its sky and its streets assume a somber hue, the scattered, leafless trees and wind-blown dust and paper but add to the general solemnity of color. There seems to be something in the chill breezes which scurry through the long, narrow thoroughfares productive of rueful thoughts. Not poets alone, nor artists, nor that superior order of mind which arrogates to itself all refinement, feel this, but dogs and all men. These feel as much as the poet, though they have not the same power of expression. The sparrow upon the wire, the cat in the doorway, the dray horse tugging his weary load, feel the long, keen breaths of winter. It strikes to the heart of all life, animate and inanimate. If it were not for the artificial fires of merriment, the rush of profit-seeking trade, and pleasure-selling amusements, if the various merchants failed to make the customary display within and without their establishments, if our streets were not strung with signs of gorgeous hues and thronged with hurrying purchasers, we would quickly discover how firmly the chill hand of winter lays upon the heart, how dispiriting are the days during which the sun withholds a portion of our allowance of light and warmth. We are more dependent upon these things than is often thought. We are insects produced by heat, and pass without it. In the drag of such a grey day the secret voice would reassert itself, feebly and more feebly. Such mental conflict was not always uppermost. Carrie was not by any means a gloomy soul. More, she had not the mind to get firm hold upon a definite truth. When she could not find her way out of the labyrinth of illogic which thought upon the subject created, she would turn away entirely. Druitt, all the time, was conducting himself in a model way for one of his sort. He took her about a great deal, spent money upon her, and when he traveled took her with him. There were times when she would be alone for 2 or 3 days, while he made the shorter circuits of his business, but, as a rule, she saw a great deal of him. "Say, Carrie, he said one morning, shortly after they had so established themselves, "I've invited my friend Hurstwood to come out some day and spend the evening with us." "Who is he?" asked Carrie, doubtfully. "Oh, he's a nice man. He's manager of Fitzgerald and Moyes." "What that?" said Carrie. "The finest resort in town. It's away up, swell place." Carrie puzzled a moment. She was wondering what Druitt had told him, what her attitude would be. "That's all right, said Druitt, feeling her thought. "He doesn't know anything. You Mrs. Druitt now." There was something about this which struck Carrie as slightly inconsiderate. She could see that Druitt did not have the keenest sensibilities. "Why don't we get married?" she inquired, thinking of the voluble promises he had made. "Well, we will, he said, "just as soon as I get this little deal of mine closed up." He was referring to some property which he said he had, and which required so much attention, adjustment, and what not, that somehow or other it interfered with his free moral, personal actions. "Just as soon as I get back from my Denver trip in January we'll do it." Carrie accepted this as basis for hope. It was a sort of salve to her conscience, a pleasant way out. Under the circumstances, things would be righted. Her actions would be justified. She really was not enamored of Druitt. She was more clever than he. In a dim way, she was beginning to see where he lacked. If it had not been for this, if she had not been able to measure and judge him in a way, she would have been worse off than she was. She would have adored him. She would have been utterly wretched in her fear of not gaining his affection, of losing his interest, of being swept away and left without an anchorage. As it was, she wavered a little, slightly anxious, at first, to gain him completely, but later feeling at ease in waiting. She was not exactly sure what she thought of him, what she wanted to do. When Hurstwood called, she met a man who was more clever than Druitt in 100 ways. He paid that peculiar deference to women which every member of the sex appreciates. He was not overawed, he was not overbold. His great charm was attentiveness. Schooled in winning those birds of fine feather among his own sex, the merchants and professionals who visited his resort, he could use even greater tact when endeavoring to prove agreeable to someone who charmed him. In a pretty woman of any refinement of feeling whatsoever he found his greatest incentive. He was mild, placid, assured, giving the impression that he wished to be of service only to do something which would make the lady more pleased. Druitt had ability in this line himself when the game was worth the candle, but he was too much the egotist to reach the polish which Hurstwood possessed. He was too buoyant, too full of ruddy life, too assured. He succeeded with many who were not quite schooled in the art of love. He failed dismally where the woman was slightly experienced and possessed innate refinement. In the case of Carrie he found a woman who was all of the latter, but none of the former. He was lucky in the fact that opportunity tumbled into his lap, as it were. A few years later, with a little more experience, the slightest tide of success, and he had not been able to approach Carrie at all. "You ought to have a piano here," Druitt, said Hurstwood, smiling at Carrie, on the evening in question, "so that your wife could play." Druitt had not thought of that. "So we ought, he observed readily. "Oh, I don't play, ventured Carrie. "It isn't very difficult, returned Hurstwood. "You could do very well in a few weeks." He was in the best form for entertaining this evening. His clothes were particularly new and rich in appearance. The coat lapels stood out with that medium stiffness which excellent cloth possesses. The vest was of a rich Scotch plaid, set with a double row of round mother-of-pearl buttons. His cravat was a shiny combination of silken threads, not loud, not inconspicuous. What he wore did not strike the eye so forcibly as that which Druitt had on, but Carrie could see the elegance of the material. Hurstwood's shoes were of soft, black calf, polished only to a dull shine. Druitt wore patent leather, but Carrie could not help feeling that there was a distinction in favor of the soft leather, where all else was so rich. She noticed these things almost unconsciously. They were things which would naturally flow from the situation. She was used to Druitt's appearance. "Suppose we have a little game of euchre?" suggested Hurstwood, after a light round of conversation. He was rather dexterous in avoiding everything that would suggest that he knew anything of Carrie's past. He kept away from personalities altogether, and confined himself to those things which did not concern individuals at all. By his manner, he put Carrie at her ease, and by his deference and pleasantries he amused her. He pretended to be seriously interested in all she said. "I don't know how to play, said Carrie. "Charlie, you are neglecting a part of your duty, he observed to Druitt most affably. "Between us, though, he went on, we can show you." By his tact he made Druitt feel that he admired his choice. There was something in his manner that showed that he was pleased to be there. Druitt felt really closer to him than ever before. It gave him more respect for Carrie. Her appearance came into a new light, under Hurstwood's appreciation. The situation livened considerably. "Now, let me see," said Hurstwood, looking over Carrie's shoulder very deferentially. "What have you?" He studied for a moment. "That's rather good," he said. "You re lucky. Now, I'll show you how to trounce your husband. You take my advice." "Here," said Druitt, "if you two are going to scheme together, I won't stand a ghost of a show. Hurstwood's a regular sharp. No, it's your wife. She brings me luck." "Why shouldn't she win?" Carrie looked gratefully at Hurstwood, and smiled at Druitt. The former took the air of a mere friend. He was simply there to enjoy himself. Anything that Carrie did was pleasing to him, nothing more. "There, he said, holding back one of his own good cards, and giving Carrie a chance to take a trick. "I count that clever playing for a beginner." The latter laughed gleefully as she saw the hand coming her way. It was as if she were invincible when Hurstwood helped her. He did not look at her often. When he did, it was with a mild light in his eye. Not a shade was there of anything save geniality and kindness. He took back the shifty, clever gleam, and replaced it with one of innocence. Carrie could not guess but that it was pleasure with him in the immediate thing. She felt that he considered she was doing a great deal. "It's unfair to let such playing go without earning something," he said after a time, slipping his finger into the little coin pocket of his coat. "Let us play for dimes." "All right," said Druitt, fishing for bills. Hurstwood was quicker. His fingers were full of new 10-cent pieces. "Here we are," he said, supplying each one with a little stack. "Oh, this is gambling," smiled Carrie. "It's bad." "No," said Druitt, "only fun. If you never play for more than that, you will go to heaven. Don't you moralize," said Hurstwood to Carrie gently, "until you see what becomes of the money." Druitt smiled. "If your husband gets them, he'll tell you how bad it is." Druitt laughed loud. There was such an ingratiating tone about Hurstwood's voice, the insinuation was so perceptible that even Carrie got the humor of it. "When do you leave?" said Hurstwood to Druitt. "On Wednesday," he replied. "It's rather hard to have your husband running about like that, isn't it?" said Hurstwood, addressing Carrie. "She's going along with me this time," said Druitt. "You must both go with me to the theater before you go." "Certainly," said Druitt. Carrie?" "I'd like it ever so much," she replied. Hurstwood did his best to see that Carrie won the money. He rejoiced in her success, kept counting her winnings, and finally gathered and put them in her extended hand. They spread a little lunch, at which he served the wine, and afterwards he used fine tact in going. "Now," he said, addressing first Carrie and then Druitt with his eyes, "you must be ready at 7:30. I'll come and get you." They went with him to the door and there was his cab waiting, its red lamps gleaming cheerfully in the shadow. "Now," he observed to Druitt, with a tone of good fellowship, "when you leave your wife alone, you must let me show her around a little. It will break up her loneliness." "Sure," said Druitt, quite pleased at the attention shown. "You're so kind," observed Carrie. "Not at all," said Hurstwood. "I would want your husband to do as much for me." He smiled and went lightly away. Carrie was thoroughly impressed. She had never come in contact with such grace. As for Druitt, he was equally pleased. "There's a nice man," he remarked to Carrie, as they returned to their cozy chamber. "A good friend of mine, too." "He seems to be," said Carrie.